I'm S.A. Bradley, and welcome to Hellbent for Horror, a podcast devoted to all things related to horror, where I remind you that you used to love horror movies, and you secretly still do.
So imagine that you're having a really bad year, the worst year you've ever seen. In fact, your town and your family are ravished by unprecedented starvation and disease. And just when you think it can't get any worse, your mother starts dancing. That's right, dancing. And you scream in terror because this is the worst possible news you could have gotten. Because if you go outside of the town square, there's a group of women there dancing away. And they have been dancing nonstop for 6 days, and the bones of their feet are poking through. They only stop dancing when they die of heart attacks, strokes, or exhaustion. This is the face of a new plague. Now, that's ridiculous, right? If this was a movie script, you'd laugh at how preposterous the whole idea was. And yet, it's a true story. In 1518, in the town of Strasbourg, Germany, the dancing plague was killing 15 people every day. And to this day, nobody knows exactly what caused it or why it went away. But it actually happened. There are moments in history where real-life horror eclipsed anything written in a story. And to talk about some of those real-life horror movie moments in history is Dr. Harold Arnn. Now, Dr. Arnn is an assistant professor of history at Penn State University, Schuylkill Campus. He's listed as an expert in political and cultural history, but over his 26 years at the university, he's taught and published a lot of articles about many different historical subjects. Professor Arnn, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, Scott. It's good to be here.
So when people talk about history, they usually think of famous events, they think of famous people, and they think that that's pretty much history. But just like real life, there may be one famous person for every 1,000 people, and there may be one really interesting day out of 1,000 days. So just like that in history, you have many more infamous days and many more obscure and weird days and people. So can you give us an example of how history can be really interesting by some of the quirkier things? I've known you for 30 years. We've been friends for that time. And one of the things that you've always done over those 30 years is keep stories of some of the most bizarre things that have ever happened in history going through my mind. So give us a little bit of an idea of some of the quirkier things that you've...
Well, I have one in mind for you today, Scott, that I think you'll enjoy. What do you know about molasses?
Well, it's very tasty, and I happen to have a jar of it right here.
Yeah, it is pretty cool stuff. It's made from sugar. When you grow sugar cane, you break the canes and get out the juice, and then you boil it, and the sugar crystals distill out, and the molasses is left over. And it has lots of uses. It can be used as a sweetener. Americans were famous for this. A lot of your favorite foods have molasses in them. Baked beans, shoe fly pie, and your old favorite apple pan dowdy. Yes. All had molasses. And that's one use.
I named my first dog Apple Pan Dowdy because of that.
I remember. And beyond that, it can be turned into rum, which is pretty valuable. And finally, industrial alcohol. That's often used in, well, back then they used it in shellacs and dyes and a few other products. Oh, and one more, munitions.
Oh, really?
Yes, it used to be used for high munitions. And this is kind of a story of where we could say molasses kind of got away from everybody.
So before we get into the story itself, because I hear you heading towards molasses, one of the things about horror and what I talk about a lot is that it's not just the monsters themselves. There's a lot that goes on in life that kind of mirrors some of the more horrific things. And when we're talking about this portion of history that you're about to go down to, it reminds me of a couple different types of horror that I think kind of dovetail into this and probably are the closest things that you'll find in real history. In other words, we know we're not going to find Frankenstein, we're not going to find aliens coming down, but there is a part of horror known as folk horror. And folk horror is basically where nature itself becomes so unknowable at one point, and usually is decimating people, usually by plague or something like that, that instead of thinking, oh, well, it's a microbe or something like that, we go to the supernatural. Where the natural gets to where we can't quite understand, we make it something else. And folk horror is kind of that. And then the other type is Lovecraftian horror. And Lovecraftian horror, obviously we're not going to have elder gods in history, but we have the same kind of thing that happens industrially. You can have man-made monsters. And one of the things that Lovecraft was very big on was telling us how insignificant we really were in the face of the universe, in the face of a cruel universe, an unknowing, an uncaring universe about us, and that there would be these monsters. And if I'm getting where you're headed, it sounds like we're about to find out about a monster that was man-made and is kind of like an amorphous blob, elder god, kind of like what was in Lovecraft's Color of Space.
That's a very good way to describe it. It's also a story of some pretty evil men that nobody saw.
So let's talk, before we get to that, we are in northeastern Pennsylvania. I'm visiting family. As I mentioned before, I've known Dr. Arnn for many years. And he is a historian who not only knows a lot about American history, but he is truly connected to the history of this area, northeastern Pennsylvania. One of the things that was kind of a folk horror, a natural disaster, a disease that nearly destroyed the entire country and entire world after World War I, or during World War I actually, was the influenza. Can you give me a little bit of an idea of what that monster did here?
Well, when the influenza hit around 1919, it really caused a lot of trouble here because, first of all, a lot of the medical facilities here were pretty primitive. We didn't have that many hospitals. The ones we had were primarily devoted for accident victims. They weren't really ready for a disease. And worse, the doctors at first would go and visit the sick and not really take any precautions. So a lot of the doctors became ill first, which, well, as you can imagine, led to a lot of trouble.
Yeah. Did the doctors, were they here or were they traveling to different areas? Because there were a lot. What was the closest military base that people were coming back from the war, wounded and stuff, that may have had the influenza?
The major one around here would have been Fort Indiantown Gap, which is down closer to Harrisburg. But the thing is, the soldiers at Fort Indiantown Gap, one of the things they liked to do was to take the bus up to the coal region, because the coal region was famous for its good bars with lots of drinking and loose women. And so you had a lot of people going back and forth. There was a huge red light district in Pottsville where, brothels as far as the eye could see, and that's going to cause trouble anytime a disease starts.
More than one disease, probably.
Mm-hmm. And all those things kind of came into play. One thing that did happen here is they fell behind as far as coffins went. They actually ran out. And so they'd take bodies and they'd bury them in mass graves temporarily and say, oh, we'll get back to them once the coffins are in. In a year or two, we'll dig them up and rebury them. But then the people who buried them died, and they forgot where they were. So we still find them. Down by my campus, we found some just across the street, about 20 bodies last year. They were widening the road, and they knew right away what it was. Oh, it's one of those influenza graves.
So you said that the doctors got sick first.
Yes.
What was the mortality rate? Do you have an idea? Was it once the doctors were gone, there were no doctors that could come here? Or?
Well, what they did, they actually were pretty smart. They sent in military doctors. There were a few of those from the outside, and they very quickly clamped down on any place where people meet. All the bars and stuff were ordered to close. The schools were ordered to close. You were supposed to stay at home, maybe not even go to work, which is a real hardship if you're a poor person, but that's what they did. And they just kind of made sure that there were no large gatherings, which seems to have worked. In Philadelphia, they lost about 5,000 a week when it was at its worst.
Wow. Here, obviously, a much smaller population. Was it like per capita, same kind of decimation?
It's a little bit less up here because you do have some people who live in more outlying areas. you could go to, well, around here we have a lot of small mining communities, and if you were in one of the right ones and no one showed up with the disease, that area would be okay. In a big city, it was a lot harder to hide yourself.
Right.
Although I do know there's a story by John O'Hara about the flu breaking out in a mine patch, which is actually based on O'Hara's experience. His father was a doctor around Pottsville.
You talked about, of course, we're in coal mine country. So it's a place where men go into the ground and sometimes they don't come back.
That's right.
A lot of people from the old world, a lot of superstitions, and there's a lot of folklore around here. So can you talk about some of the more interesting folklore that's here? I know it's not history, but in a way it is, because they're usually unreal.
I do think it is, because those stories do have a big impact on the way people lead their lives. The one story that I know that you and I were always fascinated about when we were younger was Markle's grave. Mr. Markle was from a family that owned a lot of mines around here. He was a very intelligent man. He owned several patents, and the rumor was that because he sent men to work in the mines and were killed, that caused great harm to his soul. And when he died, the rumor was he was buried in a crypt rather than in a tomb, and he had a statue of the devil in there. Yeah. And that was one thing we always were told.
And that was generation after generation, that story held. And that is actually kind of like a Halloween vigil that went from generation to generation. And several times we tried actually to get out there, because there is the way that the crypt is, it's kind of alone from the rest of the graveyard. And it's down a path that is lined with trees. And it sits there over kind of a small cliff that looks over the rest of the town. And in moonlight, it's scary as hell to go to. And when you're a teenager and you're trying to get there, of course, for some weird reason, everybody wants to go by candlelight. You get around that corner, the wind blows out the candles, everybody screams and runs away. But for all intents and purposes, Markle wasn't a bad guy.
No, not really.
And the family was okay.
Mining is a dangerous occupation, and there's really not, even with the best safety laws, you're going to have deaths, people setting off explosions underground. And we're sitting here doing a podcast. I can't imagine how we could possibly be injured doing a podcast. But,
you'll be surprised.
Yeah, well, hopefully not.
Speaking about coal mines, it seems like there's a lot of folklore around that as well.
Yes.
I think in Harwood mines, there were like 16 guys that never came back up, and their ghosts are being heard of. One of the things that I think is really interesting is the devil shows up often in stories around town. And it seems as if once you dig a hole in the ground, there's this whole thing that happens where the devil pops up. Do you think that is indicative of the area, or do you think that that's something anywhere that there's people digging in the ground?
I think anywhere somebody digs in the ground, you'll have that fear that maybe you'll go a little bit too deep and you won't like what comes back up. That seems pretty common.
And it's interesting, we're also very close to Centralia. And Centralia, for those that don't know, how long has the fire been going now?
It started in 1962, and I think it's mostly out now. The last time I went out stomping around, I didn't see any smoke. But what happened is they accidentally set fire to a seam of coal that was under the ground, and it can burn under the ground, and it smoldered away for years until it finally came to the town, and now the town is gone.
Yeah, I remember back in the 80s, I think, going there when they were, the government was buying out the houses. And so the town is abandoned. There are still people who held out.
Yes.
And they would you would have houses where there were two occupancies in the structure itself, a left side and right side. The left side would get bought out, and they would tear that down. Then they put flying buttresses on the other half because that person wouldn't leave. And it was very bizarre.
The government has announced, actually, that they're going to let the ones who are there stay till they die. Wow. They're not even going to try to get them out because it would look bad. Most of them are elderly, and no matter what the situation is, if you're evicting elderly people from their homes, you're just not going to look that good.
Yeah, but literally, if you go to Centralia, these days maybe not as much, but as I remember, you had cracks in the ground and smoke coming out of the ground.
I was there once with a visiting professor from Georgia Southern, and he stood in the same spot too long and his shoes melted to the ground.
Wow. Yeah, so folks, if you wonder why I'm into horror so much, this is where I grew up. And certainly stories like that are about. Now, a lot of what we talked about so far, we talked about influenza, we've talked about some mining disasters, and people who were relatively good, but because of the image of what they did, they had become part of the folklore. Now we're going to talk about what you wanted to talk about, this idea of the what we call the Great Molasses Flood, and that this is all a mixture of a real monster as well as human monsters, where we have a confluence of events that create a major horror story. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Okay, here's basically the background of the story. United States Industrial Alcohol Company was the major importer of molasses into the United States. They had a fleet of ships that brought the molasses from Cuba. If you can imagine, steamers full of thousands and hundreds of thousands of gallons of molasses.
And when is this?
They were in existence for quite a while, but the flood itself takes place in the early 1900s, in 1919. And it involves most of the real big historical issues of the day. You see, they'd been bringing it in, and some they'd been turning into rum, and some they'd been turning into industrial alcohol, and some they'd been selling as plain old molasses. And they'd been doing it for years, but then in 1914, World War I starts, and all of a sudden the demand for munitions went way up, and industrial alcohol was a major component of munitions at that time. And industrial alcohol came from molasses. So all of a sudden there was this huge spike in demand for molasses. The company had always had molasses tanks to store it in and to ship it to the distilleries. But with the huge demand, they decided that in Boston they needed a new tank. So they made a deal with the local railroad company to build a tank at the north end of Boston, a fairly large one. It was 50 feet high, 90 feet across. It would hold about 2.5 million gallons of molasses. So it's a fairly substantial amount.
Okay. So we're talking about molasses. You mentioned shipping and the war.
Right.
What is the shipping lane for people who are listening that's going to take us to Boston? Where's it starting and where's it going?
You have two options. If the ship really had its druthers, it would get in the Gulf Stream because the Gulf Stream flows a little bit faster. It will get you up north. You can pull in quicker. But with World War I going on and submarine warfare, the boats were more prone to hug the coast. They'd come in along from Cuba, get next to Florida, and just kind of come up. They thought that was a little bit safer, that they'd be less prone to attack there.
Okay.
So that was, I guess, their thinking in that regard. The tank was just about ideally located because it was down by the docks, and they actually had an underground pipeline which would hook up to the ship. You would bring the molasses in, store it in the tank, and then there was both a regular railroad and an elevated railroad that ran right past the tank. The elevated had freight cars, which is kind of rare for an elevated train. But you could then take another hose, hook it up to the cars, pump the molasses in, and you went out to the processing plant, which was out in Cambridge.
Okay. And this is the northern part of Boston.
Yes.
How populated was that?
It was fairly densely populated in one part. There were obviously the docks, so there's a lot of businesses as well, and restaurants and bars for the sailors and stuff like that. But there were a section of tenements. Now, the reason they picked this location, besides being by the docks and the railroad tracks, you needed both of those, was the tenements were primarily full of immigrants from southern Italy.
Okay.
And the southern Italians were absolutely notorious for not being involved in politics.
Okay.
They did not try to learn English. They didn't really necessarily want citizenship. And the word they used back then was clannish. They're a little different than most immigrants. Like if you were a Polish guy who came to America, usually the first thing you joined was the Polish Falcons, or a Lithuanian guy, you joined the Knights of Lithuania, and you join a club. Italians didn't do that. They didn't trust other Italians. They'd form groups with people from their own village who they'd known for generations, their brother-in-law, and that's it. And they wouldn't associate with a really wide circle. So by putting it there, you have a group who's not going to go and complain to the government and say, oh, you just put up a gigantic tank, I can't see the sun. So it was a good idea. They actually built it. Now remember, there's a war going on, so you want to construct it really quickly. They were working 24 hours a day building the tank. So imagine guys out riveting. It was made of 18 big steel sheets plus a roof. So it must have been loud all the time.
Yeah. And the dimensions was 50 feet tall?
50 feet tall by 90 feet across.
And 2.5 million gallons of molasses?
Well, when it broke, it had about 2.3 in its side.
How do you have any? So 2.3 million gallons.
It's about 26 million pounds.
26 million pounds of sticky, sweet
molasses. It's wonderful.
What could possibly go wrong, right?
Well, here's where the story's kind of interesting. The company did get approval from the city of Boston to build it.
Did not.
No, they did.
Oh, okay.
So they submitted plans and it was approved. They hired a very reputable firm to build the tank. It was a firm that specialized in tank building and so it looked like a really good idea, but they didn't watch close enough. Remember, there's a war going on and everyone's fighting for raw materials, and the company that built the tank skimped on the steel. It was thinner than it was supposed to be by about 10%, wow. And nobody checked.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that because we have the plans that the city approved of.
Now, we mentioned the shipping lane.
Yes.
And where it was coming from. How is that important to what happens here?
Well, it's going to be important because as long as the war was on and it was coming out of the coast, up the coast, the waters there are a little bit cooler. When you get into the shipping lane that's in the Gulf Stream, the water is warmer, so the molasses is going to stay warmer as it comes up. This can be a danger because when the molasses is warm, it will ferment and give off gas. Colder molasses will not. We think what happened is the pump that brought the molasses in from the boat came into the bottom of the tank. So what happened is they're pumping kind of warm molasses at the bottom, and the top was more or less sticky, and so the gas couldn't get through. There was a vent on top to vent gas, but it couldn't get through, so the pressure just built up and up.
Because it was at the bottom.
Yes.
Okay. So what time of year is this happening?
Well, the flood itself happened in January, which was actually a good thing, because if the molasses tank had broken in the summer, you're talking flies and rats.
Oh, okay.
And it broke during the winter. It was January 15th. It was a little bit warm, about 40 degrees, but not excessively so. And the tank went very suddenly. Just splat.
Interesting. So when I was a firefighter, one of the things that we were most horrified about was what was known as a BLEVE, the boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion. Mm-hmm. And that would happen if there was excessive heat put on something that had a vent. It was an enclosed space like a tank, and it couldn't vent quickly enough. And if there was a fire, a part of that tank would weaken, and that would be the point of explosion. Mm-hmm. And even things that aren't explosive become explosive during a BLEVE, and it's just the impact of it blowing out. Is that what happened here, or was it just a collapse?
It was just a collapse. They didn't have a full explosion. There were no broken windows or anything from a pressure wave. The tank more or less seems to have disintegrated.
It disintegrated, but there's pressure in there. So
there's
what happens when you have 2.3 million gallons of molasses under pressure?
Well, you get a wave about 25 feet high moving at 35 miles an hour.
So basically, in northern Boston, in the city, mm-hmm. where there's a series of tenements and businesses, suddenly there is a wave, a tsunami of molasses, 25 feet tall, moving at 30 miles per hour, which is faster than any carriage at that time is going.
That's right.
So let's hear what happened.
Okay, well, anybody who happened to be underground, like if you were in your basement, you were going to drown. That's it. You were just covered with molasses. You could not get out. It's thicker than water. It's much more viscous. So if you get caught in it, you're going to be pulled down. You're not really going to be able to swim through it or anything like that. You're not going to have a lot of chances to escape. In contrast, if you're on top of the wave, you can float. One guy who owned a local bar, he got home late the night before because he's a bar owner. He was laying in bed, and when the wave hit his house, his bed surfed over the top of the wave, and he was laying there on top of it. He actually was able to pull his sister out. He saw her hand up through the molasses and grabbed her and yanked her on top of his bed. And he was okay. But other people, no. If you got hit full force by the wave, one kid, he was about 7 years old, got hit full force and tossed into a wall, and it broke like every bone in his body. He had no hope whatsoever.
Wow. So that's the thing. When you hear this, you hear the Great Molasses Flood. It sounds like almost a children's story,
Mm-hmm.
The apple pie incident.
Mm-hmm.
But there's something very terrifying about this because it sounds silly, but the idea of molasses, as you said, the viscosity sucks people down. What else is happening?
Here's the real horror. There was a fire station nearby, and the molasses hit the fire station and kind of knocked part of the building into the harbor, but some people were trapped. The floor collapsed, and there were a group of firemen caught in like a crawl space, a couple of feet high, and beams from the ceiling fell on them, and they're trapped. And the molasses is rising, and they can't get out. One guy managed to kick a hole in the wall, and the molasses started draining away, but it's like a contest. Will the molasses drain out the hole faster than it will run in from the tank and drown us? One guy was on all fours, like doing a push-up, and he had a beam across his legs, and he's trying to hold his head up, and we know he was able to hold his head up for about an hour, and then he just couldn't do it anymore, and he says, "Goodbye, everybody," and down into the molasses he goes, and he drowns. Another gentleman who was a stonemason who had really strong arms was able to actually keep his head above for hours. But when he was done, his hair had turned completely white from the strain.
Wow.
They had to cut down through the building to get him out.
So how fast was, we know 30 miles an hour. How fast did this happen that people didn't have time, and how far did it extend?
Well, this is kind of the irony. Those tenements, those cheap apartments where the Italians lived, it hit the tenements and bounced back and rolled back across again. Whoa. The same area. One of the really close calls was the elevated railroad. The person who was driving the one elevated train, he stopped just in time because one of the pylons for the L crashed and the whole train could have gone over the side. Then he had to quick race back the track because another train was coming up just a few minutes later. He had to stop them too. But if he'd gone over the side, there go two trains full of people.
Wow.
Right into the stuff.
Here's a layman's question. You're stuck in molasses. How do you rescue people in molasses, and what happens once it starts to harden? Does it harden in winter?
That's a good question. I'll answer them one by one. The way they rescued them was a lot like you see people trapped in quicksand. They got ladders and laid them across so that you wouldn't sink in as much, or you could pull the person back with the ladder if they began to go under. There were 2 Navy ships at the docks, and the sailors saw what happened, and they came and they did a lot of the rescuing. The local authorities came in large numbers. In a way, the victims kind of got lucky. There was not a hospital, but it was called the Haymarket Dispensary or something. It was a branch of a hospital, kind of like I guess we'd call an urgent care nearby. And this accident happened to occur when they were changing shifts. So there are twice as many doctors and nurses there as usual. And so they began to work as fast as they could. You had to clear the person's airways or air passages of molasses. One of the problems they ran into was everyone was soaked in molasses. You'd pull them in on gurneys, which have wheels, but the molasses would leak off their bodies down to the wheels and gum up your gurneys because they're all covered with molasses.
How do you clear somebody's airway when it is full of molasses?
You have to use your hand and hope it doesn't go down that far, or use suction.
Yeah, because that's not like water.
It's not like water. It will not run out on its own.
So you're trapped in molasses. You mentioned it's like quicksand. What is happening to you?
You are probably absolutely terrified. Now, everybody knew what it was. It was not a surprise because they knew the tank was there. So everybody knew right away, okay, the tank has burst. But what you had to do was you had to stay above the molasses long enough to be rescued. And that's very challenging.
You mentioned quicksand. Is it the same kind of thing that you hear about quicksand? The more you struggle, the more you start sucking you in?
Yes. You'll be pulled under just by the viscosity. And the best thing you could do is to try to be still, but keep your head above. It doesn't sound like a very pleasant circumstance.
It also sounds like it's heavy.
It is heavy.
Did structures crash?
Yes.
Did things fall that trap more people?
One building was swept entirely into the bay. It was an industrial building, was a city paving center. A guy driving a truck was hit, and they didn't find the truck for a couple weeks. He was way out in the bay somewhere. So it was a pretty bad situation.
So you have things like Pompeii, where they dig down 30 feet and they're still finding bodies. Mm-hmm. What happens with this? How deep is this molasses grave?
Well, the trick is they discovered that you could clear the molasses, but water wouldn't do it. You had to use salt water.
Lucky them.
Yeah, they figured that out pretty quick. The amazing thing is not as many people died as you might think. Only 20 or 21, depending on how you count them. One guy died like a year and a half later, and they weren't sure if it was from the experience he went through or if it was something else. But 21 people are usually credited with dying, several hundred injuries.
Yeah. How many people were involved, trapped? How long did it take to get people out?
It took hours, especially if you were in... The firemen had it the worst. They had to go in and saw their way through one floor of the building. They were trapped between two floors. And the problem is, as you took out, you didn't know where they were. So you're sawing a hole in the floor, and you have to worry, if I make this hole too big, the whole thing's going to collapse on top of me. So they're trying to find people, and is somebody here? And, well, you were a fireman. You don't leave anybody behind. Right. They were determined to get every last one, whether they were living or dead. And they did succeed, but it was pretty tough. I think the last one they found was about 3 months after the flood.
So we're talking about medical emergencies. 1919, you're mentioning, right?
Yes.
There's also the influenza happening, right?
Well, the influenza had ended about a month before.
Really?
Yes.
Okay, so it's all everybody's exhausted and depleted.
Everybody's exhausted and depleted.
How much? You have double the amount of nurses and doctors, okay, but do you have the supplies to be able to take care of this?
They did have the supplies. The problem was if you were injured and molasses got in the wound, that you're headed for gangrene. Okay. So it was very messy.
I'm trying to think about what they were doing as suction to get this stuff out of people in 1919.
The ball suction units.
Really?
Huge.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
So
if anybody's had young children, what they use to clear their nose because they can't blow their nose yet.
So people are basically suffocating.
Yes.
And the thing that they're using is the thing that you clear your baby's nose with.
Well, yeah.
And that's what they've got.
That's what they've got.
So we have this disaster, and we have this basically the blob that appears and takes a bunch of people out. You mentioned very, very evil people. So let's talk about where we go from here.
Well, this is the really interesting part, especially up until the trial, because there were two groups that were blamed.
Yes. Okay.
Group number one was the group who had built the tank. Of course, they could say, well, the company that actually built it gave us substandard steel and didn't tell us, and that was one possibility. What makes their position kind of worse, there were three guys who were kind of the local hierarchy. Mr. Arthur Gell was in charge of the Industrial Alcohol Company's Massachusetts operation. Then there was a guy named William White who was in charge of the tank. And there was a third guy named Isaac Gonzalez who's listed as a laborer. But I think that's wrong because from the accounts, it seems like he did everything. He'd come and he'd hook everything up and pump everything out and vent all the gas. And Isaac Gonzalez had recurring nightmares for years that the tank was going to burst. Mm-hmm. It lasted 3 years. And he lived about 2 miles away. He'd wake up in the middle of the night, run across town, show his ID card. Remember, this is a militarily useful substance, so the military actually guarded the tank. He'd go running in and he'd be there venting gas and in the middle of the night because he was convinced it was going to go. He knew it leaked and leaked pretty badly. Mm. In fact, neighborhood children would come up with little cans and scoop up the molasses and go consume it. So he knew, and he told everybody, hey, it's leaking too much, but nobody would listen to him. They thought he was nuts. Some nights he actually slept there because he said that he could wake up and maybe spread a warning when the tank began to break. Huh. Now here's the other side of the story, which is tricky. Remember I said Italians don't like to do politics? Well, if you did do politics and were Italian at this time, you were an anarchist. Mm. Boston is a hotbed of anarchism. Think Sacco and Vanzetti. Mm-hmm. And anarchists did not support the war effort. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company was one of the companies they targeted. Their New York facility, they actually had anarchists try to bomb it during the war, but they used some dynamite with a faulty fuse, and so it didn't go off. There are two United States industrial alcohol ships that disappeared during the war, and we think they were sabotaged and blown up. We can't even imagine today why anyone would sabotage a molasses ship, but back then that was considered a war product. And Boston had other disasters too. There's a factory up in Lawrence where they made, I think, uniforms, and that was bombed. So Mr. Gonzalez, who sometimes liked to sleep at the tank, also claimed that one night he got a phone call and the people said, we're coming to blow up the tank. Mm. They did blow up the police station, which is just a couple of blocks from the tank. So this was also, when the tank exploded, this was also a theory that perhaps an anarchist snuck in, dynamites the tank, and then sneaks away. It just so happened that the day of the explosion, Mr. White, who always ate lunch at his desk and never left, this one day decided to go out and have lunch with his wife in town, and there was nobody there at the tank. So that became the alternative theory. Is it some sort of an evil anarchist who did this to destroy us all?
So what happened with all of that?
Well, it goes to court twice, once for criminal grounds, and everyone agreed there wasn't enough evidence for the company to be found criminally negligent. They had the tank erected by a reputable company. They did have it sealed several times by a person who would come in and caulk the tank to make it tight. In fact, someone had done that just a month before it broke, and it was a very skilled caulker. Ironically, we know because the company that did the caulking, a lot of their workers had died from the flu, and they only had one guy left, and it was like their most experienced guy. So he came and he caulked it all up and did the usual thing and stuff like that. So criminally, there were never any charges filed. Civilly, there were. The state of Massachusetts did something that wasn't really done too often back then. They let all the victims kind of combine their cases into one class action suit. And matters were heard by an auditor, and he said, no, I don't think there's an anarchist who blew it up. I think the tank just wasn't good enough. And so they did have to pay damages. They settled out of court. United States Industrial Alcohol actually paid about twice what they were told they had to pay, just to make it go away, which was a fairly large amount. Mm. I think today it would be about $5 million.
Okay. So you mentioned the legend or the theory that there were Italian anarchists that may have done that. What was the complication? What happened about that?
Well,
what happened to the Italians?
What happened to the Italians? Many of them got deported. The ones who were anarchists, actual anarchists seemed to be pretty good at keeping lists, and so they all knew who everyone was. You've heard of Sacco and Vanzetti. Mm-hmm. They're up there. They're being sentenced to death right around the time this trial was going on. There was evidence of posters which had been put up around the tank threatening that we're going to blow this up because it's a war thing and, oh, that's really terrible and stuff like that. But what really hurt was the fact that the company did not inspect the tank when it was built. Yes, they were shortchanged on steel, but they should have checked. And the fact that they'd always ignored Mr. Isaac Gonzalez because he had testimony that, it's leaking too much. There were pieces flaking off. He complained and complained and complained that it leaked too much. And finally, what Arthur Gell, the local manager, did was he painted the tank the same color as molasses so no one could see it leaking. And then Gonzalez quit and he joined the army because he said he'd had enough. He couldn't take it anymore.
So you have anarchists that are getting deported. The warm-hearted Bostonians, how did they deal with the rest of the Italians with this accusation that Italians right around this thing may have caused it?
It depends on how you want to look at it.
Okay.
Generally speaking, your average Italian guy did not suffer too much. But there were anarchist parades and stuff like that, and people would be mobbed. There's one shootout at an anarchist rally and stuff like that. So if you were known to be associated with anarchists, then you got into trouble. If you weren't, you were usually okay, which I always found kind of surprising. Usually we tend to lump everyone together.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised because it seems as if to get some of the blame off of the company, this kind of thing comes up, which may or may not be substantiated, and that usually causes a great amount of fear. Normally when we're in fear, we tend to do something a little bit unusual around that.
I think the anarchists might actually have been visible enough that you could focus just on them.
Okay. So there's diabolical evil when people conceive this kind of thing. And then there's the diabolical evil of trying to cover it up. What's the most evil thing that's going on in this story?
I think the most evil thing is probably that no one is listening to Isaac Gonzalez.
Why not?
I don't know. He was just a laborer, but he seems to have known exactly. I can't imagine a guy coming in venting gas in the middle of the night and doing all these other things. He obviously knew the tank really well. I don't have an organizational chart for this company, but I mean, I work at a place with several employees, and if I came in and began doing things late at night, I'm sure I'd be in a lot of trouble. And this guy had this sort of authority where he just showed his membership card and came in and was running around like a nut.
Well, it's funny because it's kind of like the template of every disaster movie you've ever seen. There's always the one guy that nobody's listening to.
He knows it's coming.
The dam is going to break and all that. And here it is, real.
Yeah. Yeah.
And people die under millions of gallons of molasses because no one's listening to this man.
And he's the one person we don't know what happened to. We can trace all the others, where the survivors and stuff, where they went. Mr. Gell winds up passing away in, I think, 1963 in Maryland. Ironically, one of the guys who gets caught in the flood and had a fractured skull went on to become a famous boxer. But he lived to be like 90 years old. So it was... But Mr. Isaac Gonzalez, who had the potential to be the big hero, we don't know what happened. He just vanishes.
So we have this disaster, this tragedy happen in 1919 in Boston. A little bit earlier and a little bit closer to home, we have a flood, a real flood that happens here, the Johnstown Flood in 1889.
That's right.
Let's talk a little bit about that.
That's a very similar kind of a thing because, once again, no one is exactly sure what happened. This dam was an utter disaster.
What dam is this?
It's above the town of Johnstown. It's on the Little Conemaugh
River.
Yeah. Well, it's more of a stream up there. But what happened is the state of Pennsylvania built a dam there. And they built it to provide water for the Pennsylvania canal system. When the canals went out of business, replaced by the railroad, the Pennsylvania government said, well, we don't need this dam anymore, and just walked away and abandoned it. Somebody came and bought it, but the only reason he bought it was to yank out the discharge pipes and sell them for scrap. The minute he did that, you can never empty the dam if you need repairs. You basically dam the dam, if we want to call it that. Then a gentleman named Mr. Ruff purchases the dam and sets it up as a swanky resort for wealthy people from Pittsburgh. It's called the South Fork Hunting and Fishing Club.
On a dam?
Well, the lake behind the dam.
Okay.
They actually had a steamboat you could ride, and you could rent canoes, and it was very nice. I've seen some pictures of it. Really very fancy cabins and a big dining hall where everyone liked to eat together. And he did periodic maintenance on the dam. He threw garbage on rocks and tried to patch up weak spots. But he didn't do anything to totally repair it. He just kind of saw it as nuisance stuff.
Right. So let's give the listener a little bit of context. We've mentioned a few different things here. We have a dam,
Yes.
which at one point the federal government was involved
Just
with, correct?
Pennsylvania.
Oh, just Pennsylvania. The state government is involved with. And we have a canal system, and we have a town.
Yes.
So describe what the canal system was and why this dam and the canal system is so important to this story.
Okay. Well, the canal system in the early 1800s, Pennsylvania, the big problem this state has is it's divided in half by mountains. And it was very difficult to go from the east to the west. The canal system was supposed to take care of that. They actually had a very elaborate, technologically advanced system of canals and incline railroads, which you could put your canal boat on, which would allow you to travel back and forth across the state. And they invested a tremendous amount of money in this, and then the railroad gets invented. And all of a sudden people say, oh, we don't need this canal anymore. Some of the canals were still cost effective if you had a very heavy freight haul like coal. Coal is hauled by canal until fairly recently. But for most purposes, the railroad was better. So they abandoned the canals and just went with railroads.
So now the canal that we have here, is it one that raises and lowers? How valuable and important is this dam to the stability of the canal?
It's absolutely vital. They don't have enough water. During parts of the year you get droughts and whatnot, and there was just not a dependable supply of water there. So you needed the dam and the lake to provide the water, or the canal wouldn't work.
Okay, but we have water basically at a certain level
Yes.
going through all of these towns.
Yes.
Was Johnstown on the canal, around the canal?
Johnstown was on the river that flowed near the canal.
Okay. How big was Johnstown?
It was pretty big. It had a decent-sized steel mill. Which I would say 10,000 would be my guess.
Of the population of the town?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And now we have
This dam
a dam
that is not properly repaired, that can't be fixed. The person who owned the steel mill down at Johnstown sent his engineer up to look at the dam because he was actually worried about it. And the engineer comes back and says, this dam is not really very safe. And the owner of the steel mill wrote and said, let's split the repair costs 50-50. I'll pay 50, you pay 50, and we'll get this fixed. And Mr. Ruff wrote back and said, no, I'm not going to fix it. It's fine the way it is. Be quiet. And it's none of your business. And so nothing got done. And there was another, these very rich men who were in the South Fork Hunting and Fishing Club. One of them also stopped Mr. Ruff and said, we're members of this club. Can we see documentation proving that the dam is in good shape? And Mr. Ruff said, oh, don't worry, the dam's in good shape. If there's any problems, I promise I'll fix it. And they shook hands on it. And Mr. Ruff never fixed the dam. And then one day, the skies opened up and there was a torrential rain. So much rain that it had never been seen like that before. Places where you never saw rivers were just forming. It was very heavy rain, and the dam broke. It just went, and the water came down. Johnstown was several miles away, but they couldn't get word there fast enough. There had been flooding, and there was a telegraph. Someone went out to telegraph, look out, the dam's breaking, but the telegraph poles had fallen over in the dam and because of the heavy rain and flooding. And so they didn't get word in time.
What was the scope of what was happening with this dam? So when we think dam, either we think, the Hoover Dam or a dam built by beavers or something like that. So how big was this thing?
It was about halfway between a beaver dam and a Hoover Dam. It was an earthen dam. It wasn't really that fancy, but it did have a lake behind it. So there's a lot of water in there. And what hurt Johnstown is, if you ever go to Johnstown, the Conemaugh comes straight like this, straight across, and then there's a cliff that sticks up hundreds of feet, and the river makes a 90-degree bend. Well, the floodwaters come down and hit the cliff and bounce back into the town again, just like the molasses hit the tenements and bounced back into the town.
So you basically have a tsunami.
Yes.
Another 25-foot nightmare coming at them?
Worse, because Johnstown had several tanks of natural gas which ruptured and exploded, and the wood debris from the town catches on fire, and so now you have guys in the water, but the water's on fire.
So you have to stay under.
Yes.
What was the damage?
I cannot recall the exact number of people that drowned, but it is 4 digits.
I think it was 2,209 last I saw.
Most of them never identified because there's no one left to identify them. The irony is, like I said, there's this large cliff. Some of the people at Johnstown lived on top of the cliff, and they're 100% fine, but the main part of Johnstown is totally destroyed.
What happens? What's the repercussions after this?
Well, once again, it's time to get your lawyer and sue.
Right.
And once again, there's a big problem because they've done a number of engineering studies. In fact, they still do them today sometimes, just to check. And so far, about half the engineering studies have suggested that even if the dam was in tip-top shape, it still would have broken because it was raining too hard.
Because of the rain.
And that makes it kind of a vague situation. Mr. Ruff had a heart attack and dropped over dead before any of this happens. Mm-hmm. So no one can sue him. He's not there.
What happens to Johnstown?
Johnstown recovers. The people showed a tremendous desire. In fact, they had the steel mill reopened within a week, and everyone had gone back to work. They didn't have homes anymore, but they're still working away. One of the people who was a member of the South Fork Hunting and Fishing Club, worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad, and he made a very concerted effort to get supplies into town and stuff like that. The Red Cross goes in. It's a disaster, but Johnstown recovers fairly quickly.
Well, any other stories that you can think of off the top of your head that are regional, that are kind of disturbing in such a way?
Well, there's always the famous Sheppton mine disaster.
Do tell.
The mine caved in. Everyone believed that the miners had to be dead. There was no way they could be rescued. And the proper procedure was you'd go to the widows and they would sign the death warrant, and then you didn't have to search for them anymore. Well, one widow said, "No, I'm not signing. You have to keep looking. I don't care." And they brought in well drilling equipment, and they drilled down to this one spot where the mine was still open, and several of the miners were still alive, and they were able to eventually lift them out. Now, a couple of the miners disappeared, and one of the rumors is that, of course, they were eaten by the miners who survived because they were underground for quite a while.
How long were they underground?
A couple weeks.
What kind of mining was it?
Coal mining, anthracite coal.
Okay, and that's digging tunnels into the ground?
It can be. There's various ways to get it out. It depends where the coal is.
So for the Sheppton mine,
Yeah.
what was it like?
It was a tunnel.
And so how many went in and how many came out?
3 came out. I think several dozen went in.
3 came out.
Yes.
Any folklore, music, stories about those 3?
No, we don't have any really good stories about those 3.
That's a very disturbing story, to say the least, to be someone who they just kind of give up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it is frightening because sometimes you did find people long after you had given up who were still alive. We had that over this way towards the town of Harley, where the mine broke. It flooded, actually. They accidentally dug into a pool of water, and the mine flooded. And there were these miners trapped, and they were sure that they must be dead. But these miners had took their shoes and belts and actually ate them. They ate the leather their shoes were made out of, and they found them weeks later, and they were still alive. And the thing is, they made fun of guys who had died. Just didn't have any stamina, couldn't hold out. It's a pretty terrible attitude.
Small shoes.
Yeah.
His belt was too thin, or he'd have made it.
Yeah.
So, obviously, you have a ton of stories that have kept you excited about history through all of these years. What's the thing that really excites you the most about history itself, the stories?
What I really like is trying to figure out why things happened. It doesn't really matter what the event is, which may sound kind of strange, but to actually be able to kind of put yourself into a person's shoes and walk yourself through an event. Why did they make this choice? Why did they do what they did instead of something else?
What do you think was the most amazing story that you discovered in your studies, where you thought you knew what it was, and in your discovery of it and finding out the why, it was something completely else?
I think it's something probably most people don't even know about. We're fairly near the town of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and Wilkes-Barre was originally settled by people from Connecticut. At the time, the people from Connecticut thought Connecticut jumped over New York and continued into northern Pennsylvania, and they seemed to have believed they were still in Connecticut. And what I found really fascinating is I did a lot of research on that, and it reached a point where you'd be reading a document and some person's name would be mentioned. John Smith got up and spoke at the meeting, and I'd read so many things by John Smith. I knew what he was going to say before he said them. I'm like, oh no, not him again. And that was really kind of cool to know people that well, people that most folks don't know, that even probably local historians don't know that well.
You mentioned something very interesting about borders. Connecticut, people from Connecticut in the middle of Pennsylvania. Well, not middle, we're northeastern, but there's a state between Connecticut and Pennsylvania, and they thought they were in Connecticut. Tell us a little bit about Creesap's War, which has a little bit to do with this kind of thing.
Oh, this is a nice story. When Pennsylvania was founded, of course, there's no GPS. No one knew where the border between Pennsylvania and Maryland was. So what would happen is you could be a settler and you could buy land from William Penn for a piece of land in Pennsylvania, and you would get there and there'd be another person already there saying, no, this is Maryland. I bought this land from Lord Baltimore. And there would really be nothing you could do about it. There'd be no way to tell. Well, most of the early settlers in Pennsylvania were Quakers. They didn't believe in violence. Early settlers to Maryland had no such problem. There was a gentleman named Mr. Creesap in particular, and he believed that Maryland extended a little bit further north than we do today. And he was arrested by the Pennsylvania authorities. They took him to Philadelphia for trial.
Now, why are they arresting him? What's going on here?
They believed that he was well into Pennsylvania territory, and he's there building a farm with a deed that says Maryland. So they thought he was obviously wrong.
So what does wrong mean in this? Is it taxation? Is it eminent domain?
It's where do you purchase your land from? William Penn and Lord Baltimore both made their money selling the land.
Okay.
And so they were determined to have their fair share.
And neither of them are friends.
It's not so much a matter of friendship as it is an honest disagreement. If you can imagine, we can't even imagine it today with our technology, but it was really hard to tell where the border was.
Right.
It took a couple of astronomers, Mr. Mason and Dixon, to come and take very elaborate measurements to even, mark it later.
So basically you're having these disputes over things that are basically speculations in the first place.
Yes.
Now, you're saying this man is about to get arrested and go to Philadelphia. Is this the start of the war? What is Creesap's War?
Okay. Mr. Creesap goes to Philadelphia and he says, well, my goodness, Philadelphia must be the biggest town in all of Maryland, which, of course, was not what he should have said. They locked him in prison, but he cursed so violently and used such foul language that the jailer actually made him leave. He would not have such foul language in prison.
Because they were Quakers.
They're Quakers. Later on, Pennsylvania sent authorities to arrest him, but Creesap was too tough for them and single-handedly fought everyone off.
So basically what you're saying is Creesap, a man who cursed like a sailor, comes to Quaker territory, has a deed from Lord Baltimore. They don't like what he's saying. He goes to jail because he besmirches the fine name of Philadelphia by calling it a city in Maryland, somehow offending the Quakers so much that they jail him. And then he is let go because he has such bad language. He curses so bad that the Quakers let him go, but he's still considered a refugee on the run, and they come to his barn or his farm. So let's talk about what happens in this barn.
Well, he begins by shooting out of the barn, and Quakers don't like that. That's very troublesome.
Who's he shooting at?
The local, basically, police.
Okay. Lawyers, things like that.
Yeah, things like that. Pennsylvania did not have a military, so it's just guys. They set his house on fire, but that didn't really seem to bother him too much. He came out and continued with a great deal of violence. He was just a very tough, miserable guy.
Did he take prisoners?
Yes, at a few points he took prisoners. He locked them in his house. He wouldn't let them out.
So this is people who came to take him to justice, or were they there to
They were
talk
there
to him?
to take him to justice.
So basically what he did is he took all of his jailers and jailed them in his house.
Yes.
So what happens to Creasap?
Eventually he does go back to Maryland. He has enough. It's too much of a pain in the neck, and he leaves.
So truth is very strange, to
Yes.
say the least.
You should hear the story of Fry's Hot Water Rebellion.
Then perhaps we should.
Okay, it happens in Allentown. The government...
Say the name of that again.
Fry's Hot Water Rebellion.
Fry's Hot Water Rebellion.
Yes.
Okay, very good. Now that we know that this is Fry's Hot Water Rebellion in Allentown, tell us all about it.
Okay. The government had instituted a tax, and they wanted it to be fair. They wanted the rich to pay more than the poor. But at that time, there's no W-2 forms or stuff like that. So they decided that the proper way to decide how rich you were was to count the number of windows you had in your home.
And this is a tax on?
Windows.
This is a tax on windows.
More windows you have, the higher the tax is.
Okay.
So the tax collector arrives in Allentown, and he goes up to the houses and begins to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 windows. The people of Allentown did not want to pay the tax. While the tax collector was counting the windows, they would go up to the second floor of their homes, open the window, and pour hot water on the tax collector, which made the tax collector very mad.
How long did this go on?
A few days. The tax collector had them all arrested. There was no room in the local jail. The jail was too small. They locked them all in a bar because that was the largest building in Allentown.
A bar.
Yes. And here's where Mr. Fries enters our story. He busted everyone out of the bar. He came down and somehow smashed his way in and let everyone out. Then, as everyone's escaping, he literally stood up on a barrel and gave a speech where he announced that no one would have to pay this tax anymore, that Allentown, Pennsylvania was no longer part of the United States, and that he, Mr. Fries, was now in charge of Allentown.
Okay, one has to ask, what happened to the rebellion and what happened to Fries?
Soldiers were dispatched to Allentown. Mr. Fries ran and hid in the woods, but he made one mistake. He left his dog behind. The soldiers untied his loyal dog, who led them right straight to Mr. Fries, who was arrested. They sentenced him to death. They took him to the gallows. They put the rope around his neck. It was almost time to pull the handle. And then someone stepped forward and handed him a pardon from President Adams and told him to go home and quit causing trouble.
How does that happen? Did he have connections with Adams?
No, Adams just decided this guy's a nut. I want to scare him into behaving better, and it's not worth my trouble to kill him, and I'm just not going to do it.
How big of news was this rebellion? Because it got to the president.
It got to the president. It was pretty big. This tax was, you don't want to protest against a tax to spread. You want everyone to know that if you don't pay your tax, you're in big trouble.
How many states are there at this time?
There were, it's 1797. Oh, boy, was Kentucky a state yet? I'm not sure. So 13 or Vermont might be in. So somewhere between 13 and 15.
Okay. Is this the center of the United States in Philadelphia at this point, or is it in Baltimore, or is it in Washington, D.C.?
By this point, the capital was on its way to Washington, D.C. I'm not sure if it was there exactly yet. It might still have been in Philadelphia. I know that Adams is the first one in the White House.
That's what I'm wondering, if that's how the news got there so quickly, because Philadelphia and Allentown aren't that terribly far from each other.
Yes.
Well, this is fascinating stuff, to say the least. And of course, we find out that there is a lot of really interesting idiosyncratic things that are in the history of our country and in the world. Many of the things that you can find out are just as bizarre as any story that you may be able to read. What if there was one thing that you would love to get across to people who are interested in stories and in history? What would you like them to enrich themselves with?
I think the really important part is to think of it as a story. Too many times I have students come and history for them is a list of things you memorize. This happened, and this happened, and this happened, and there's absolutely no understanding that it happened for a reason. For them, it just is a bunch of random stuff. And if you look at it that way, you will, first of all, not understand it very well, but also you'll miss the real enjoyment. I like to tell everyone that history is about people, and people are fun because they do fun things, and do sometimes not so much fun things. But if you want to really understand people, in history you get to see them at their very best and their very worst.
Yes, indeed. So, Dr. Arnn, thank you so much for being on. As I said before, Dr. Arnn is an assistant professor of history at Penn State University, Schuylkill Campus. Can you give us a little bit of information if people wanted to know a little bit more about either the stories that you're talking about or where they can contact you or find out more information? Can you give us a little bit of information like that?
Yeah, I think probably the best way to contact me is just on Facebook, because I am on there and I will answer any historical type requests. There are sources on most of the things I discussed. For the Molasses Flood, a book by Mr. Palaio called Dark Tide is probably the best example. If you want to know more about the Johnstown Flood, go to the website for their museum. They have an absolutely wonderful museum on the flood right in the city of Johnstown. You can also go to another museum, which is up by where the dam is, where the dam broke. So you can go there, although that's not quite as good. The one in town, I think, is a little bit better. There hasn't been much done on Fry's Rebellion. It's more just a footnote, but it's there.
And you've been published often in articles, correct?
Yes.
Where can people find some of your articles?
Oh, boy. I really don't think they'd like to read my articles. They tend to be a little bit dry and academic.
Fair enough.
Fair enough.
Well, once again, thank you so much for being on the show. And for those that are listening, thank you so much for giving me some of your time. Until next time, stay hellbent.
Keep out of the molasses.
And thanks for listening to the show. Hellbent for Horror was written and broadcast by me, S.A. Bradley, and produced by me and Lisa Gorski. You can find more on our website, hellbentforhorror.com, and I'm also on Facebook at facebook.com/Hellbent for Horror, and my Twitter handle is Hellbent Horror. You can find Hellbent for Horror on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher, and other podcast platforms. And H4H has its own app. You can download it from the Google or Amazon store for Android, and the iPhone version is available on the iTunes store. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay hellbent.